Hello everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be looking at PowerShell Remoting with PowerShell 7 and Windows 11. So one of the things you've probably seen in some of my recent past videos here is I've been playing around with Windows 11 a little more. And with that, with the new kind of PowerShell age, I guess, we have this scenario here where you have two different versions of PowerShell that live on a Windows computer nowadays, and Windows 11 just basically being the latest version of the operating system. So what I want to look at is the remoting piece of that when we're kind of looking at PowerShell remoting. Alright, so let me first begin here. Let me change over to my domain controller. So I'm looking at right now a 20 something domain controller here. Binver. Server 2022, which is set up in an Active Directory domain. And what I've been using for a test network here. So I have a simple Active Directory set up here. Chassis TAC, chassitac.com is the domain name. And my admin user I'm playing around with is this user called admin. All right. Now, in addition to that, I have in my computers here, I have this client 3 VM, which I'm also going to be playing around with, which is Windows 11, and is pretty much just set up with some of the defaults that I've gone over in some earlier videos. So I installed PowerShell 7 on it. I joined it to the domain, changed the taskbar around a little bit just for what I like, and that's pretty much all I have on it here. So if I do an NS lookup on it, client 3, it has an IP address, the domain in my network here. All right. So again, kind of thinking of how computers are set up nowadays. When you have a computer, if it's a Windows operating system, it comes with PowerShell 5.1 by default. And we could see that if we type in the variable here, PS version table. And that shows us the PowerShell version of 5.1. And with this, this is the version that comes with all of your, let's say, newer operating systems. So Windows 10, Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2019, Windows Server 2022, Windows 11 for that matter. They all come with PowerShell 5.1. So you might be thinking that they've kind of stopped development on PowerShell, and that's not the case here. So they've stopped with PowerShell 5.1. They've basically stopped development of Windows PowerShell. So again, if you look where my cursor is right here, see how it says Windows PowerShell. So that is the version of PowerShell that comes with Windows, hence the name Windows PowerShell. So if you've looked at my earlier video on setting up PowerShell 7 with Windows 11, I had mentioned that there is another version of PowerShell that Microsoft released. It originally started with version 6 and is now at 7.3, I believe, at the recording of this video here. My VMs have 7.2, by the way. Okay, so what is this? Well, with PowerShell, with Windows PowerShell, I should say, Windows PowerShell at version 5.1, that is what came with your Windows operating system and is reliant on the .NET framework. So basically the version of the .NET framework that's packaged up with a Windows operating system. Now that was a bit limiting in the Microsoft world if you wanted to use PowerShell on other kinds of operating systems. So if I wanted to use PowerShell on a Linux computer, if I wanted to use PowerShell on a Mac computer, something like that. So Microsoft has a version of .NET that runs on those. Okay, so I believe it's referred to as .NET Core. At least it was. Its name might have changed, but .NET Core is a version of .NET that runs on non-Windows operating systems. It will also run on Windows OS as well, but its primary goal is to run on non-Windows operating systems. And there is a version of PowerShell to go with that. And that is what we refer to as PowerShell, not Windows PowerShell, just literally the single word PowerShell. And that was first released with PowerShell version 6. and is a separate download. It does not come packaged up with the Windows operating system. So the Windows operating system still comes with Windows PowerShell version 5.1. And they're not adding any more features to this. So if you want to kind of utilize some of the newer, let's say, services or features that might come with newer versions of PowerShell, you have to install this new universal version of PowerShell. Right, so I went over how to do that in a previous video on setting up my Windows 11 computer with VS Code, Visual Studio Code, and PowerShell 7 if you want to check that out. Okay, so here, let's say I want to get into now the remoting side. Okay, so if I kind of switch over to the desktop here of my Windows 11 box here, which is named Client 3, you can see I have a PowerShell console here, which is let's do PS version table here, and that is 5.1. And I also have PowerShell 7 installed. Let me go ahead and run that as admin. So I also have PowerShell 7 installed and PS version table on this one, and we're doing 7.2, right? So I have both of those running, right? Now, if you are familiar with PowerShell remoting, remember that remoting is a way that I could remotely open a PowerShell session on a remote computer and basically run code in it. So PowerShell remoting is kind of like the equivalent of almost like remote desktop, right? Where you could get a Windows desktop from a computer that you're not sitting in front of, right? So with this, this feature is what we refer to as PowerShell remoting, right? Now, um, with whether it's enabled or not on a server, remoting is actually enabled by default. Right, starting with server 2012, I believe, remoting is enabled by default, and it is not enabled on client operating systems. So Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 11, PowerShell remoting is disabled by default. Okay, so if I were to try to remote into client 3 here. So basically you're looking at the desktop of client 3 right here. Let me go back to my domain controller and try and reach out to it remotely. So if I try to do something like enter PS session and computer name client 3, we're going to see that that should crash and burn here. Right? Let's hope it does. That's what I'm expecting. So, and it's thinking about it. And there we go. Okay, so it failed to connect. Now, clearly the computer is there. You just saw me look at the desktop of it, but I'm not able to connect, basically because remoting is not enabled yet. Okay, so there's a few different ways to enable remoting. I'm going to do it the manual way. So I'm going to go over to client 3 over here, and I'm going to open PowerShell 5. Okay, so just the Windows PowerShell here, and we're going to enable PSRemoting. Now let's so should just be able. Oh, I don't have a administrative PowerShell prompt open here. Bear with me one sec. Give myself some admin rights, and now let's do that. So enable PSRemoting. Right, and we can see that it is doing some things here. So it adds an exception to the firewall, turns on the WinRM service, configures the WinRM service to start automatically when you reboot the computer and stuff like that. So at that point, we should be good. Okay, so if I come over here and do the enter PS session now, notice I get in. Okay, see how the prompt shows client 3, and anything that I type in here, let's say I just do something simple like hostname, is being transported over to client 3, run in a PowerShell session in the background, and the results are returned here, okay? Like so. So it's almost like the equivalent of like doing Telnet or SSH or something like that. You're opening a remote console over on another computer, except in this case, it's not a console like a command prompt or something like that. It's PowerShell. Okay, and if I want to get out of this, I could type exit PS session to get out of it. Okay. Now, before I do that, though, let me just run that variable again, $PS version table, and you'll notice the remoting connection that I get into is 5.1 on the remote computer. Okay. So that's what was connected to. So now let's go ahead and do an exit PS session, and now we're back to our local prompt here. If I do hostname, you can see I'm now back on DC1. All right. So when we remoted, we enabled remoting through PowerShell 5.1. Right? And that's pretty much the only way to also do it in bulk, by the way. Okay, so if we were going to want to enable remoting on like hundreds of computers or thousands of computers, you're probably not going to, go to each one, type enable PS remoting, and call it a day. So in group policy, we could also go have some fun here. So in a GPO, and again, I'm just editing the default domain policy. You would obviously want to make a GPO that affects whatever scope of computers, whatever, grouping of computers you wanted to turn remoting on for. Remembering that it is already on for your servers. So you'd want a GPO that's probably targeted to your client computers. Okay, but the setting is found in the same spot regardless. Okay, so I would go into computer config, go into policies, admin templates, Windows components. I would go down into the Windows stuff here, and you would think that it's Windows PowerShell, but you would be wrong. Remoting in PowerShell uses components out of the Windows Remote Management, WinRM, which is actually a part of a generic protocol you find on the internet called WSMAN, Web Services for Management, of which WinRM is Microsoft's version of that. So that is a kind of open, I don't want to say open source, but basically free to use management protocol for a client service running on one computer talking to a service on another computer. So you can find WSMAN used in a lot of different things out there. And what's nice about it is it's standard ports, so 5985, 5986 are the standard ports on it, and it encrypts all traffic by default if you're sending management traffic from one computer to another, even with the, what might be considered the unencrypted port number 5985. Okay, so it's rather nice to use. So PowerShell takes advantage of that as well. Okay, so if I were to kind of go in here, expand it out, go to WinRM service, you can see right here and allow remote server management through WinRM. Okay, so I could go into that, enable it, and the listeners here, the IPv4 and IPv6 filters, allow you to potentially filter what address ranges could remote into a particular computer. So if you wanted to just limit it to maybe the computers that are a part of your internal LAN, if you just want to put an asterisk there just to say any IP address could remote desktop into a computer, you could do that as well. Okay, so that would be again an in bulk way of enabling remote management here. Now, once that is done on the client computer here, let me switch over back to the client here, and oh, I just realized. Oh, my bad. Let me double back. I just realized I didn't change the recording desktop here, so you guys probably didn't see any of that group policy stuff. So hold on one sec. All right, so the group policy stuff that I was showing here, I was looking at the default domain policy. We went down to computer config, admin templates, Windows components. down to Windows Remote Management and the WinRM service there. All right. So, and then again, this is the setting that we wanted, and we could enable it, and we could do an IPv4 or IPv6 filter for what computers were allowed to connect. Or if you want anything to be able to connect, you could just put an asterisk there. All right. So that would be an in-bulk way of enabling remoting on a lot of computers if you wanted to do that. My apologies for forgetting to switch the desktops here. All right. So let me go back to my client computer. And once remoting is enabled, you can type in get PS session configuration to see what remoting endpoints have been created on a computer. So if you see here, I have three of them. So there is Windows, Microsoft.Windows PowerShell, PowerShell.Workflow, and a 32-bit version of PowerShell. So this client computer is running 64-bit version of Windows. So this is the one that is connected by default when you remote into a computer. Okay? And that is always going to be that way, even with PowerShell 7, believe it or not. Okay? So this is the remoting endpoint that is being connected to. And you can see on that there are permissions for who's allowed to connect into this. So NT Authority Interactive, that system group, built-in administrators, and built-in remote management users. Okay, so built-in just means the local security. So the local administrators group, the local remote management users group are who allowed to connect to this particular endpoint. All right. So notice there's no PowerShell 7 to be had here. So if I, in fact, open PowerShell 7, let's go ahead and do that. And let's type this get PS session configuration. We can see that there's, in fact, nothing there. Okay, so I have not enabled remoting in 7. Okay, so I could go through the same steps here. Where I could type enable PS remoting, right? And let that go ahead and do its thing. And if we go back to this get PS session configuration, we could see that there's now some 7 endpoints set up here. So there's PowerShell.7 and PowerShell.7, and then the actual version numbers. So for purposes here, I mean these are basically going to be identical. So um, same permissions for who's allowed to enter them. And now if I go back to the PowerShell version 5 side, and do get PS session configuration, you'll notice that they're all listed here. So here were the PowerShell 5 ones, and notice the PowerShell 7 ones. Okay, so we have all of those available here. So this again is the one by default that's going to be connected to, but you can see these other ones are here as well now. Okay, so let's go back and look at life from another computer here. So let me go back to my domain controller here, functioning as the remote computer. And let's say we're going to again do the enter PS session. Okay, now if you're wondering why it's not prompting for credentials, understand that they're both part of the domain. It's using my Kerberos account token that's being passed over from one computer to the other. So it is logging me in. Like for instance, if I do who am I, it does know who I am, right? So so there's no backdoor around security here. All right, but if I go back and I do the get not get but PS version table, you can still see I'm hanging out at version 5.1 here. So how do I connect to that version 7 endpoint, if you will? So depending on which endpoint you want to connect, remember we had, PowerShell.7 was basically the name of the one that we were looking for there. So what I could do is, first of all, here, let's do an exit PS session just to get out of that. And then let's say I want to go and I want to try and get into the 7 one there. So we could still start with the same command here, this enter PS session, except before you hit carriage return on it, we're going to add another parameter here called configuration name. And we're going to go and grab PowerShell.7, .8.7. And that now connects me. And if I do the version table, I could see that I'm now using PowerShell 7.2. So that allows me to now connect to a PowerShell 7 session through remoting. Now, what if you don't want to use enter and exit PS session because they're kind of like one-off endeavors here? You could use the other commands that use remoting as well. So new PS session or invoke command are both ones that we could take advantage of. So for instance here, if I were to do invoke command and computer name, let's do client 3 and configuration name, PowerShell.7 and script block, oh no, let's just do something like that. Oops, something like that. And all we're really doing here now with invoke command is it creates the PS session on the remote computer, runs whatever code you tell it, either a script or just some code in a script block here, runs that code, and then exits the session. So opens the session, runs the code, and then exits. All right, so if I run to that, you can see that it ran in a 7.2 PowerShell session on that remote computer. All right. Now, um, so with that, let's say that I want to do a lot of invoke command lines and I don't necessarily want to have to enter this stuff all of the time. What you could do is save in a variable, like maybe $S for session here. Let's do new PS session to computer name, client 3, and configuration name, PowerShell.7. And now, if I want to use invoke command, what I could do is specify the session that I wanted to connect to and then just maybe my script block. Right? So maybe we'll do PS version table like so. Right? Um, oh, also helps if I spell. There we go. Spelling does help. So that runs, and now the beauty of the session is if you look at your sessions here by doing get PS session, you can still see it's opened. Okay, so I could keep running invoke command against that session over and over and over again. Okay, so it's kind of the neat thing about sessions. And then when you're done, you could take the variable with the session in it, bring it over to remove PS session to then close it down. All right, so not too bad there. Now, the one kind of caveat though, or gimmick, or whatever you want to say, is okay, well, I enabled remoting in PowerShell 7 by going to the computer in question. Okay, so I went over to client 2 here, and remember that I opened up PowerShell 7 and I typed, enable PS remoting. So what if I need to enable remoting in 5 and 7 by default in both, then I need to do it for like 1,000 computers? Well, that might be a problem, right? Especially if you don't want to walk around to each computer individually. So there are a few I guess ways to do this. I've seen people online use like a scheduled task. I've also seen um, using like a login script or something like that. You could also Use, let's say, use remoting to do it, believe it or not. Okay, so basically, if you want to use kind of like the script thing, you could again run the commands like I mentioned earlier, enable PSRemoting in a PowerShell session on a remote computer. You know, if you could figure out how to do that through a scheduled task or through a login script or something like that, it's not really that bad. Like in a login script, the PowerShell 7 executable is not PS, PWSH. Okay, that is the actual PowerShell 7 executable. So you could kind of run this in like a run line and be able to pass commands in. So this will actually take some parameters to it. And so one of those could be, and kind of scroll up in the help here, the command line right here. Okay, so if I wanted to basically, do this, I could do something like this, dash command, um, and then what do I want to run? So what I want to run would be enable PS remoting. And if you wanted to, maybe you could throw the force switch or the force parameter on it to make sure it runs. So if you could, have your line here that could run PowerShell 7 and then inside of it enable PS remoting, that could potentially, do it for you. Now you could also bundle this up right here and deliver that to the remote computer's version 5 console. So if I were to take this and let me just copy this to my clipboard here, and let's put this inside of a remoting session. So like literally like invoke command the computer in question that I want to connect to. Let's say that could be client 3, and then this would be my trying to get tab complete to work here. That would be my it does not want to do script block on me. Let's there we go. So in the script block, we would do pwsh.exe and the command we wanted to run, and that would be enable PS remoting dash force. Close that and close the overall script block. So that could be something that could be delivered to a remote computer to basically get PowerShell 7 set up to receive remoting connections. Okay? And again, don't worry too much about limits on this. So by default, the WinRM client that's present on um, Windows 11, Windows 10, Windows Server, whatever, that supports up to like 300 remote sessions. So you're not going to overload it as well. Right? So that could be a way to deliver that. And again, if you're wondering, well, you're putting in the computer names individually here. That's again, you could gussy that up as well by specifying maybe a different way of getting computers. So maybe do a parenthetical expression, something like that, where you do get AD computer, and then maybe filter something like operating system like Windows 11. Actually, I don't even need the Windows, just 11. So yeah, so asterisk 11 asterisk, something like that. Um, so yeah, oh, that filter should be like that. Okay, so that could go grab all of the Windows 11 computers in your environment and then pipe that over to something like for each object, member name, and just grab literally the names of the computers. All right. So basically, this is going to grab the Active Directory computer objects. This is going to grab the names of them as string objects, which is being presented to this parameter, which takes string objects. So now this could go, and this little command right here could find all the Windows 11 computers, connect to them, remote into them, right? So invoke command, that'll connect to the PowerShell 5.1 endpoint, and then this would run on there to turn on remoting for the 7 endpoints. So you could then remote into them using PowerShell 7, okay? Kind of like I had used, apologize for the scrolling here, kind of like what I had used earlier here. So I could specify the configuration name. So once again, it's enabled. We can go into that and away, and away we go. All right. So again, let me bring that down to that final command so you guys can see that again. All right. So that's what this would do. All right. So if I wanted to turn that on in bulk, that's a potential way to make it happen there. Let me just hit enter, see what this thing does. Um, Probably because it's already been enabled here. So I will leave it with that. Um, and that could again could be your in bulk way of doing this. All right. Um, so let me just for argument's sake here, change that part over to quotes. See if it makes a difference. Yeah, so it did. Cool. So give that a shot. And again, the rest of this is aborting out because I already had it enabled. Okay. So that gives you that option to remotely turn on the remoting of PowerShell 7. Now, that kind of seems a bit obscure there, but anyway. So again, if you just want to start it up, we've already gone through how to connect here. So you could specify, again, your configuration name, and on the computers in question, um, if you just want to start simple here, just enable PSRemoting in both the version 5 console and the version 7 console, and both will be running. All right. So let me wrap that video up here then, and if anybody has any comments or anything, please throw them down in the chat, in the comment section for the video. And if you like this, please give me a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and we will see you in the next video. So have a good one, everybody.